and we're a group of volunteers. We've been gathering content and really trying to get the message of social responsibility in all of its forms out to the various members and member units. We have a LinkedIn group that we encourage, if you haven't already checked it out, we encourage you to join. In fact, I'll just take a minute to, uh, if you can see the my screen, I'll just, Norval, can you now see a LinkedIn group?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so this is our group. Jennifer, who's on the call, is the group manager. She's also the chair of the SRTC, and this is a very good resource to just start to become better acquainted with some of the topics and the people involved. One of the things that we're doing is we are collaborating with other divisions. We've been very fortunate to collaborate with the Quality Management Forum, and if you go to this link, the Winter 2017, you will see an edition of the Quality Management Division Forum, which is themed on social responsibility. So this gives a chance to learn more about the topic and integrate, and I encourage discussion and interaction so that we can grow our community. This is something that is very important, not just for our organization, our individual profession, but for society at large. So with that, I will resume the presentation, and the way I'll do this is there's a lot of content to get through. We've got an hour. I will go through all the content, and following that, I'm open to questions or discussions about this or about anything that may arise. So I thank you very much for your indulgence. About myself, Norval was very gracious, and I think there's me in real life and me within ASQ. In both cases, quality is something that's very important, not just to do the right thing, but to do it in a way that makes whatever you do sustainable. So whether it's software, whether it's services or manufacturing, there's always something that can be done that's conscientious and protects those around you. It's important not just as individuals, but as members of families and communities to keep this in mind. So with this particular presentation, I'm going to talk through a cost of social responsibility model that extends from cost of quality, incorporate some risk assessment, look at some cost categories. So yeah, Saturday morning cost accounting, I'm sure that's the most exciting thing. But once we start talking about some specific examples that touch on our everyday lives, you'll see where this is meaningful and significant. So what inspired me? Social responsibility is a topic that's being addressed by some of the most prominent business authors, specifically Porter and Kramer. And the idea of corporate social responsibility is extending beyond something that's nice to do or something that's a public relations activity to a strategic part of business management, something that integrates what we do for ourselves as an organization, what we do within our communities, and in the places that we live. So it's very much an intersection of different interests coming together. With our profession, one of the pillars is that by having quality infused early on in preventative and designed in, that reduces how much quality has to be involved in terms of failure resolution. So if we can bring down the failure costs, that will bring down overall costs. So it's in the same mindset, we've looked at how can this be applied towards social responsibility. So social responsibility extends beyond simple product failures. In fact, it's a very holistic discipline. And in the table there are the different principles that are associated with social responsibility. So because of these principles, there are additional costs, aspects, and impacts. So ways that what an organization does affects not only its immediate operations and those of its immediate customers or users of its products and services, but also the society community at large. And even in ways that were not intended, and I'll demonstrate that through some of the examples in this presentation. So because of the broader scope, there should be a commensurate cost model that incorporates those additional items. Risk management is very important as part of social responsibility because without that risk mentality, you don't have a way to anticipate what could go wrong and take appropriate steps. So corporate social responsibility means different things, different mentalities. And I'd like to address the approach that is suited for this presentation. Um, those of you who may be familiar with the work of Milton Friedman, the quote that I associate with him is, "There's no free lunch." He is a very popular economist several decades ago, and his view of a company is that the best thing it could do is to make as much money as possible, and through its profitability, that was its contribution to society. In other cases, social responsibility is an extension of a company's charity. Tradition might have referred to this as noblesse oblige. When you are fortunate, you give back to others. And those are perspectives. The perspective in this case diverges from those two extremes in that doing social responsibility is not just good, but the business can benefit from that by having better operations. Also, within the quality profession, we are often a bridge between different areas of an organization, and an issue like social responsibility is dependent upon the constructive and collaborative involvement of different groups within an organization, particularly human resources, legal, and marketing, who have to have to combine what employees do, what the companies do for their contractual commitments and the regulatory compliance, and the interactions with customers, both preventative and as remediation and damage control. And as we go through these examples, you can see just how much more broad-based social responsibility is than quality. Okay, so in this, what I'd like to do so far is go through what the cost categories are, how these costs are applied for examples from the past and current issues today, and then project costs in a future industry that's actually becoming more realized, and you'll see in the examples what I'm referring to. So with that, the cost model that is shown is slightly more extensive and has more categories than the traditional quality model, which is failure, prevention, or appraisal. And I will go through each of these distinct categories. I set them up to align back to the social responsibility principles, and that will be described. The idea is that the biggest unlimited category would be the correction, which would be the treatment, recovery, and remediation. As you can see on the right, there are two diagrams, but they're not necessarily to scale. Particularly with something like social responsibility, the costs of treatment, recovery, and remediation for an extreme incident can be infinite and can considerably outweigh the other categories. The idea is that if you have the other categories active, that will reduce the need for treatment and recovery. So the first thing, as with any management discipline, with any management system, the more you acknowledge and track, the more internal responsibilities you have to take on. And the first thing with social responsibility is understanding your stakeholders, and even just having a roster of who is affected and impacted by the products and services or the involvement of your organization. So that means recognizing who is involved, to what extent are they, do they influence, are they decision makers, and how does your organizations or your businesses work affect their ability to carry out what they need to do. And it starts from the immediate span of control within the organization or enterprise, and then it goes out peripherally to until you hit society at large. And this is um, financial terms, reputation, goodwill, and a recent example. And I'll bring this up later. But one thing that I follow when I look at the ASQ organizational website are the headlines and also some of the LinkedIn discussions. And with some recent manufacturing issues pertaining to Kobe Steel, Takata, um, the Takata airbags, there is a statement that perhaps there's a problem with Japanese organizations. So even though a few organizations within the country have public issues, that casts the entire country and culture in more negative light than the current perception. So it just shows how um, problems in one area can cascade to affect other unrelated areas. Now, governance within social responsibility, this is within the organization, and it addresses how a commitment made at the top level, let's say the board or executive leadership, is propagated through every department, every functional area, so that there is a consistent um, adoption. And this is part of it is making sure that the culture of that organization has social responsibility infused, but also creating that accountability so that when individuals are measured on their performance, in addition to their profits and new products developed, all of the tactical aspects, they're also measured on the performance relative to social responsibility goals. What this does is ensures that success within an organization, social responsibility is not seen as something as an impediment or conflicting with success, but is complementary. So that's internal to the organization. There's also the oversight from bodies external to the organization. And this can range from some industries have self-regulating bodies which do this. However, when you have as an after effect or a consequence of serious social issues, sometimes governments will um, extend the amount of regulatory coverage. So that could be any. We'll see examples with automotive how following some serious issues, the various environmental regulations and safety regulations had external um, oversight bodies to watch and monitor these private companies so that while it comes with a cost, it's also seen as a way to mitigate future problems. So that's, and that, you know, as part of that oversight, that's an extension of the accountability of our various levels of government. So mitigation and contingencies. This very much is consistent with the risk management practice. We also now within quality we have risk-based thinking as part of our current ISO quality management standard. So when you have a risk that's you're aware of, one of two things can happen. You can either mitigate it so that the risk is no longer significant or it's reduced in its severity, or if the risk is cannot be prevented, then you have a contingency plan so that when that whatever it is that occurs, you've got something that can mask the damage or take alternate steps. In the case of technology, a contingency plan would be that if the technical solution malfunctions, you can revert to a manual solution to carry on what's needed without disrupting what you provide to the customer. If in the case, say, of a pipeline, if there's a leak in one of the pipelines, then that pipeline can be built within a structure that could contain some of the leakage that it doesn't seep into the environment. So it's there are a number of issues, but you can't do that unless you first know what the risks are and the impacts to those risks. This is the big one: treatment, recovery, and remediation. This is where it can be public, and especially when the effects are widespread, that makes the recovery that much more extensive. And it's also another problem with this is if the problem or a malady is identified quickly, it makes it easier to address and recover. However, if it's concealed or covered up and then eventually discovered after years of neglect, this is even more difficult to recover. So it's identifying what the problem is, understanding the breadth of it, and then taking steps to not only fix it, but getting those lessons learned and how do we prevent this from happening in the future. So there's an expression by Benjamin Franklin: experience is a dear teacher, but fools will learn from no other. So when you have this experience, what can this what sort of improvements can be made? And that is where you populate the other categories. Advocacy. This is something that doesn't necessarily have to be owned by a business organization. It's people who are directly affected, and quite often it's a grassroots um, organic response to a potential situation. So this could be anything from advocating for better labor rights, better environmental practices, and by addressing those issues, bringing them forward to the influencers and decision makers, that ensures that those are part of the overall solution. And along with the advocacy is the adoption within not just the organization, but also among the partners, the vendors. You know, companies that have a very broad supply chain and manage them very rigorously have found that adopting SR practices can be very effective. So this is where they can use their power not just for their own organization but for society at large. Some examples are major retailers which have a requirement to limit the amount of transportation or limit the pollution done in the manufacture of those items. So controlling a supply chain is a way to have a make a significant impact to the social responsibility. So adopting this comes back to once the commitment is made, then again, how is it monitored? How is it propagated through the organization? So having this, we are in the quality profession, but part of our quality tracks ASQ. Our headlines track issues which are also social responsibility issues. There's a very wide intersection, a broad intersection between quality and social responsibility. So some examples, this changes constantly. It when I updated this last week, the lead poisoning is a very serious example. That's something that also was part of the Flint water system that created some very serious consequences. Again, faulty airbags, they're still leading to automotive fatalities, so it's something that goes beyond just a product malfunction. It's life and death and care and control of those in whom we trust to get us safely from A to B in all circumstances. The smartphones, I've got some examples about the smartphones overheating, and then by different design, when you have a potential, not just a product risk, but also that the rapid battery loss of people are using their smartphones as a potential emergency device, that not having a valid battery could have implications. And then medical, in Canada, the EpiPen is for allergies, and if the shortage It's almost like people have to get a renewal every month. And if there isn't product to support this particular medical condition, that could create a spike in how many people have to use the emergency services. So I'm sure if you looked at the ASQ this week, and I actually did prior to this presentation, I'll just quickly uh, go to the website. So this is ASQ as of today, and you can see examples of even more diesel emissions. One of the restaurants is not able to serve a food product because of salmonella. There's some issues about artificial intelligence and people and their livelihoods. So I encourage you to. It's another good reason to review the ASQ website, but to monitor what's happening in the industry and then consider it from a social responsibility perspective. So I've referenced that how does this cost model apply to specific examples? So looking at examples from the past, I've got some categories: big auto, the automotive industry, and some from the 1960s and 70s. The Corvair was released with safety problems. How many of you have ever heard of an individual named Ralph Nader? Ralph Nader made his initial reputation as an advocate of auto safety. His famous book was titled Unsafe at Any Speed, and it profiled the problems with the Corvair. In the 70s, the Ford Pinto was released with a known issue that they costed out how much it would cost to fix it, and they chose to release it anyways. So the result is that um, the safety flaw resulted in explosions. So, and then recently, and I say recently in the last 3 years, and this is still ongoing, the emissions, the Clean Air Act, and Volkswagen had a famous defeat device which was used to, when it was activated, the emissions would be much lower, and then it was deactivated in normal use. And because of this, there were serious penalties, even with one of the executives being imprisoned. So this is showing how social responsibility, because with some of these visible and highly public actions, the extent now to which the automotive industry has to operate. In fact, it's a leading, it's ahead of the curve for quality in most cases. It's a source of innovation, and the oversight is extremely high across different countries. So it's quite rigorous to operate in this environment now. Um, in terms of the costs, that by refusing to invest an extra $5 to $8 a vehicle, the Pinto explosion cost millions of losses. Penalties, Volkswagen in particular, and then through some of its other subsidiaries have to be affected with billions of dollars, and it really took did a considerable damage to the very good reputation that Volkswagen had built up over the last few decades. And as part of cost of doing business is all the safety and regulatory compliance involved in automotive. So that is something which um, is part of the whole social responsibility solution. So this is, by looking at one industry, we can take this and apply it to other situations. So the good part is that there are some examples. I use Toyota and Volvo because those are very visible. Toyota, I had the opportunity to meet in Milwaukee in 2016. Toyota was recognized with the ASQ Duran Medal, so I met with some of the senior executives of Toyota, and they were very proud about their concept of social innovation, in which SR is not just something they do nicely. They recognize that it will differentiate their company from their competitors that, especially if you've got a lot full of cars, what would make you purchase a Toyota instead of someone from a competing organization? And so the social responsibility aspect is something that people respond well to. Volvo is extremely they've always been had a reputation for having a safe car. In fact, to the point of parody, there's a old Dudley Moore movie where they even mocked it because of its safety, but it was still so that it's a very much a top of mind consideration. So they've made a public declaration of an accident-free automobile, and that has redirected their design. And now that we are having and entering an era of self-driving cars, um, the combination of this has great potential for positive social responsibility. But it also these are things in which SR has to be managed. A second category involves energy to do with mineral spills, whether it's liquid petroleum or heavy metals from a mining facility. If these are not properly controlled, this can cause damage to otherwise pristine environments. And there are different things that, from a social responsibility perspective, have to be managed. If you have the early warning systems and the build in those across an organization and the oversight that can hopefully identify the potential alarms for a quick response and build in redundant designs to capture and contain some of those potential problems. But if not, then it becomes extremely expensive and distressing for the surrounding communities. So as you can see on some of the images, going back a few decades, Exxon Valdez was a very significant spillage which affected local wildlife, for long-term damage. And then even recently, the spillage of oil from pipelines, some of these costs are into the billions, and when in fact, for much lower cost, if the safeguards and the redundant designs had been applied, that could have been better for the organization, and it could have helped the surrounding area. This is a particular risk, not just economically, but also politically. Um, there are two reasons. First, if you look at the bottom, some of the charts, the mineral and resources revenues are much lower than they were 5, 10 years ago. And so in such environments, companies will be forced to make compromises, and some of those compromises could come on areas like safety and preventative maintenance. That adds to the risk, so that makes this even more problematic. As far as the political issues, one is where some of these pipelines or minerals, where they go, and how people who hold that land perceive it. So in the case of the Dakota Access, that was on a very sensitive area, so that ties into some of the stakeholders affected by that are those who believe such a pipeline would be an intrusion to their what they consider to be sacred ground. So organizations having to operate in these environments have to incorporate the views of all the stakeholders, so that it's gives a fair and holistic solution. By not doing that, that can be a source of future problems and anguish. Smartphones. I'm sure we're at the point where it's more the exception than the norm if you don't have a smartphone, even multi-generational smartphones in the house. So, it's the kind of the joke that everyone's got a computer, more computer power in their pocket than people used to put a rocket on the moon in the late 60s, and we use it to search for cat videos. But there are SR issues related to the manufacture, development, and ongoing use of this. So in the preparation, there were labor problems in the past because of some very competitive operators were sacrificing um, basic human principles in order to meet production deadlines. Um, the product safety, Samsung has been the most prominent, but it's the design of the smartphone in general has this risk. And then even if you have a properly made phone and it's used without immediate product risk, how it's misused, that can create problems for society as a whole. So so some examples of costs, when overtime violations for the production. Now the Galaxy recall, I remember being on flights where they would announce along with line up with your bags, and if you have a Galaxy 7, you cannot board this plane. So they had to collect it and confiscate it so that it would not appear. And then the misuse of those phones, and some of these phones, because they have the ability to have malicious applications, you can get the identity fraud, and that will. Um, this is a problem if you use public networks, for example, and then someone can take on your identity without your knowledge and do things that um, are improper. Um, I've had this in a mild case. I was at a Starbucks. All of a sudden, someone was posting in my name about this diet that I didn't do. So, and that's just from being in a Starbucks for 30 minutes. So it's you have to be very careful with your security and with with who's you don't know who's sitting beside you and who has access. So, and then in future considerations. The lifestyle of having this, on the one hand, by everyone having access to a video camera and microphone in their pocket, um, they can capture images of government abuse or law enforcement abuse, which can be done positively to show that in the pursuit of social justice. In the other hand, though, if you have too much addiction, even especially while you're driving your safely made car, trying to use your smartphone at the time, it's distracted driving, which causes problems. And then overall, if you can't talk to people face to face because you can only connect through a smartphone, that has a human impact. Okay, so the last category with this, and it's one that's quite interesting, being on the West Coast. The West Coast states have adopted legalization of marijuana, and I think, in Canada is set to do this in 2018, but there are more questions I have than answers because there are so many ways to approach this particular commodity. As you can see, there are multiple applications, whether it's people want to see it as something that they put in their food, as something medicinal, as recreational, whatever reason people want to use it, that introduces more concerns and considerations. Also, who would be, which regulatory group would own marijuana legalization and control? It's a crop, so would it come under agriculture? It's as a narcotic, as a food additive, it could come into the food and drug because it has potential medical applications. Healthcare would have to be involved in its dosage and proper use. Because it introduced legalization, it's not the same as free use. In fact, it's a very controlled use. So those legal controls would have to be done through justice, law enforcement, and it's a product that's a very lucrative product. So that would show make it interesting for import, export, and economic development. And because you have multiple regulatory groups, you could have the potential for conflicting priorities and incompatible rules. So the person from economic development who wants their city or their province or their state to prosper and flourish may want the aggressive distribution that is more than the Justice Department wants to have circulating in society. So trying to find that balance, I think, will be a very tricky thing. Coming from a perspective, in my past years, I've got the ASQ biomedical and HACCP training from when I was working with medical devices, and I think that those regulations are quite stringent. And if we were to apply the same um, protocols for marijuana as we do for any kind of pharmaceutical or any kind of medical product, you would find that some of the producers would be very it would be quite an adjustment. So as far as Canada, Canada's assessed who's using this and what is what are some of the implications. So, but even though just because it's already widely in use, the tricky message is that if the government is not preventing its use, it's implicitly endorsing it. And that is something that the government has to be very careful of qualifying what is suitable use and consumption. As far as the United States, as you can see, this is a recent image of where it's legalized and it's compared to where it's still restricted. There are different law enforcement. So my understanding is that federally, marijuana is still a controlled substance. So how do you regulate what happens in the United States and what happens like in different parts of the United States? It's also just because something is legal, what are the limits? And those limits have to be known. For example, my city border is Washington State. If you cross the border, you see billboards and storefronts of places where you can buy and actually enjoy marijuana in various forms, like not just smokable, but however they're consumed. And then if it looks like if you're to go across the line to Idaho, it's a completely different thing. So do you have border cities that cater to Idaho citizens? So some of the implications, there are health risks, and it goes even further. Knowing that something can go wrong, it's just a matter of everything. In the case of Ford or Exxon, when there was a problem, you had a responsible entity that could do the remediation. Ford and Exxon could finance the recovery. If something like that were to happen with marijuana, is there a singular body that could be called upon to compensate and provide that remediation? They're also looking at what organizations have to do within and also the level of oversight. Have we made the preparations to deal with that, those potential catastrophes or potential consequences? And the third point is if something is going beyond the intended use, and whether it's a food product or health, there's a recommended use and that you don't mix with other substances. So if people disregard that and something happens, who takes responsibility and of those social maladies? So it's very, very important to learn from lessons of other industries and ask those questions and get those answers before a new substance is unleashed to the public. This is also the images from a comedy routine by Joe Rogan. He's describing when he goes to purchase marijuana and he asks, "Is it strong?" And the response is that facial expression, and to which he replies, "That is not a unit of measurement." So it's we don't really know enough about the product that we can make reasonable, rational decisions. So there is a need for standardization, even of the commodity. And if you compare to things that people enjoy, if you have a wine, you can know where it was made, what type of grape it is, what's the alcohol content, and how is it best served. If it's steak, you know what the grade of meat is, what the cut is, how it's prepared, how much it is, and then so you can have these things with other things, but with marijuana, you don't know if you buy a substance in Vancouver, is it the same as you would buy in Southern California? And do we have those defined commodities? And what does it mean for impairment? That is an example in Vancouver. If your blood alcohol system is 0.08, you're impaired to drive and you're penalized. What is the equivalent once marijuana is legalized and adults can use it? What is the tolerable amount that they can use before they're permitted to drive a car? And if those questions aren't answered, then we're placing ourselves at risk of a serious catastrophe. So looking at some of the additional questions, looking at within an organization, having social responsibility will differentiate from competitors, and having this has been used very effectively by companies like Toyota, Volvo, Whole Foods, and then that it's something that distinguishes them from their other competitors. Social responsibility, because of the potential for losses, has to be treated as not just the cost of doing business, but as a strategic part of your business plan. And knowing the potential of something going wrong, that potential should justify the investment in some of those preventative or proactive aspects of a social responsibility management system. So with that, I will open up for any questions, or if there's any part that someone requests elaboration, I'd be delighted to assist. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dan. If anybody has questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll take them in order.
I'm just, I'm not able, because of how I'm sharing, I'm not able to see the chat box. So, Norval, can you read them out and then I can just respond?
Yes, I'm monitoring it right now.
Okay.
Have not seen I'm sorry. Here comes a question right now. Let's see here. One person says, I may have missed it, but can you put a dollar amount on these?
I did put dollar amounts where I had the information. I'll go, but those are also from the, for example, on the smartphones. I was able to find that what the cost was for the recall of the Galaxy, and so in terms of what the remediation was. In terms of the other categories, it'd really be dependent on the organization itself. So that the starting point would be to do a risk analysis of what could go wrong and what the cost of that potential would be, what it would mean for the organization, and then the risk of that happening would be a percentage. So if you had a 1% risk of a major $10 million event, then you can calculate that as a true value, and then that can be a budget to justify some of the other additional monitoring and reporting that you have to do, and also some of the additional training across your supply chain.
Okay. Before we go into the next question, we've got a few of you who signed in with just your first name. If we were able to figure it out who you are, we've got you counted for. If we weren't able to, we sent you a private chat. Please take a look in the chat box and see if you have a chat from either myself or someone else. We're going to go ahead to the next question for Dan. How does this model relate to third-party certifications such as B Corp certification?
I'm not familiar with B Corp certification. I'll have to answer that. I'll have to get a better understanding. I think that this model extends beyond certification because I view certification as a form of oversight. So it would be part of that category. This model would, because certification, and I'm basing this on some of the ISO certifications and similar management systems, you work to the level that the certification demands, and you give the auditor what they need to get the check mark. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you do everything that's needed for the business. So I'd say this model extends beyond a certification, and certification would be a subset of this model.
Okay. We'll move on to the next question here. Is there a social responsibility ranking of companies like the Car Safety Awards or such consumer awards that distinguish companies?
I would expect that there would be. I'm not familiar of one that comes to top of mind. If anyone on the call is familiar with a particular protocol, please bring it forward. I do think that there are various consumer reports that are captured. For example, with the automotive, they do capture, safety, most usable, best service, and you could derive the best performers from those particular categories. It's also social responsibility, unfortunately, is really your reputation is as good as your last action. So a company like Volkswagen, I think, would have ranked very highly up until the point that its defeat devices were discovered by aftermarket testing. So it's something that if they do have such a ranking, you should always get the most current version, that year to year you know what the current management of the company is doing.
We'll move on to the next question for Dan. What about the percent of reducing the cost of poor quality as it relates to CSR?
I've actually had this question in prior presentations. I created this model in reference solely to SR, and it would work alongside the cost of quality. The cost of quality is, that's very important for, managing the production of of whatever product or service, and I think that's a very important strategic consideration. I would see that as, part of developing your solution. The reason that it doesn't quite apply is because the scope of a quality system, there's a point where it stops, whereas the scope of social responsibility extends far beyond the organization into the community and into society. So, it's I think the question that's been asked is, can you take the cost of quality and infuse it into social responsibility? That would be part of, again, that would be a subset of what's being done within the governance of the organization. The governance is tracking its, and also the adoption. So as part of the, having social responsibility being doing the best for society, cost of quality is a measure of how much waste there is in the organization, whether you're wasting it by rework or wasting it from inferior products. So that I think would be a measure of internal actions done to support social responsibility.
Okay, moving on to the next question here. In the cases you've named, mass media attention was used, and I suspect drove companies to gather the information. Without a failure, how could you get management on board to provide resources to determine something that may not happen?
Well, this is, I think it starts with the vision of the company and how they want the company to operate in its market. Even though it hasn't happened, there's still the potential for something happening, and you have to. First of all, it really depends on the management ethic itself. If you're saying, how would you get a rational manager to adopt this? And I think you have to make the case that with any business activity, there's a reasonable chance of something unfortunate occurring, and you take precautionary steps. It's the reason that companies buy insurance. It's the reason that you have preventative maintenance. That argument, you can make that argument from a risk management, and if they have risk averse, appeal to the risk averse side. Some businesses don't want to be open to that. A very good example was the proprietor, the CEO of a company called Theranos, where she publicly mentioned anyone who has a backup plan has already admitted they're going to fail, so I don't believe in backup plans. And then a few years later, after making that bold comment, her business was at a very much a disadvantage because some of the blood test products that she was marketing had turned out to have some serious quality issues. And because blood test has a medical dependency, that in itself is a social responsibility area. So I think you can make a rational argument. You can't control what the management, how they'll respond, but you can look for examples in media of other industries and learn from those so that you don't repeat them within your own organization.
Okay, the next, let's see, well, we have a comment from one of the participants thanking you for a well-done presentation. It addresses the mindset of those who think social responsibility is for the wealthy versus businesses just trying to make it. Social responsibility makes good business sense.
Thank you. It's and that was very much what I hope to achieve. So I'm glad that that point resonated with you.
And then another comment, many OEs are beginning to require formal social responsibility programs along with various ISO system compliance. This cross-mapping of the concept of cost of quality to cost of social responsibility is very strong.
Thank you. I think if I do another version of this, I would more explicitly map between the two, because I think that it's extensions of the same discipline. So if companies already have a cost of quality, how can that be extended to accommodate, in the same way that a quality management system can be extended to accommodate environmental management, social responsibility management, safety management, a robust cost of quality could be expanded to incorporate social responsibility as well. So thank you.
Oh, and one other thing, Dan, I've gotten a couple of private chats asking if a copy of the slide deck is available, and if I remember correctly, you did provide me with that in advance of today. Is it okay to share it?
Yes, I'd be delighted if you shared it. And it's
Okay.
there's also an article that I'll do it on request because it's a bigger article, but it's was published in the journal, ASQ Journal of Quality Participation. And if anyone wants to send me, I've got my email if you want this article, I'd be delighted to send that as well.
Excellent. I don't see any other questions coming up. We'll give folks a few more seconds if they want to submit another one. While we wait for them to do that, I'm going to remind everybody once again that our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, January 30th, with Willie Van den Brande, presenting on survival of the fittest, quality tools of the future. It'll be 12 noon Eastern time, so hopefully many of you will be able to join us at that time. Dan, I'm looking at the chat box. I'm not seeing anything else come up as far as questions or there's a few comments saying thanks very much and wonderful presentation. And I completely agree with that statement.
Thank you. Before I conclude, one of your future speakers is Jennifer, Jennifer's the chair of the SRTC, and I was very impressed with the list of the breadth of speakers, especially the keynotes that you have. I think you've done a wonderful job in gathering a lot of the top-level ASQ talent. I'm very honored and humbled to be among such an impressive contingent of speakers. So this is truly one of the highlights of my ASQ experience, so thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for the reminder about Jennifer. We do have Jennifer Stepniowski online with us, and she will be presenting for us, as Dan alluded to, on supplier social responsibility on February 27th, which is a Tuesday. Glad to have her willing to do that for us. It's quite an honor to have her as well. I also saw online that we have Kristen Case, who will be also presenting for the section in March on managing internal audit program. Glad to have her online as well. Great to have folks willing to give up a little bit of their personal time on a Saturday to join us. And based on what we saw, it looks like we have had almost 50 people with us today, which is good for a Saturday. So, Dan, I'm not seeing any other questions coming across. So with that being said, I guess we're going to call it for today.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, Kristen.
Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and call it for today, and hopefully we may see many of you on Tuesday. And until then, I'd like to thank everybody once again for joining us. Thank you again, Dan, for the excellent presentation. We're going to go ahead and say goodbye for now and wish everybody a good rest of the weekend. Bye now.